lot of people around the world are talking about Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow.
Someone is provoking the bottom line of China. They are urging the Taiwanese independence movement to become bolder and bolder.
They have to decide. They, Taiwan, not us. And we are not encouraging independence. We're encouraging that they do exactly what the Taiwan Act requires.
Japan's relations with China has been very, very sour. It is quite natural for the Japanese people to worry about Taiwan contingency.
台湾是中国的事，不关日本的事。
서로의 그 안보를 피로써 지키기로 약속한 그런 국가이기 때문에 거기에 걸맞는 그런 관계가 다시 자리를 잡아야 될 것으로 생각합니다.
Scenes that shook the world. But in Taiwan, a territory situated more than 8,000 kilometers away, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was met with more than just shock and horror. It triggered waves of panic among some segments of society. They continue to grapple with the question, when will Taiwan be next?
之前觉得不可能的事情，我觉得看到俄乌战争之后，你会觉得事实上是有可能的，而且不管它有没有可能，我觉得台湾人都要做好准备。
民间方位的话，我想至少每一个人都要有这个意识，就是有可能爆发战争，那才不会真的事情发生的时候大家很恐慌，因为最怕的是社会的恐慌，然后还有大家有投降主义弥漫。因为我想在整个军事评估上面，台海如果爆发战争的话，其实中国会付出非常惨痛的代价，但前提是台湾有坚决抵抗然后不投降的意志。
To prepare themselves, some Taiwanese have signed up for special courses on how to survive a war zone. Known as I Can Help workshops, these courses impart participants with skills to save lives and the knowledge to navigate hostile environments.
除此之外，紧急应变不是只有急救，还有搜救、通讯、避难所的管理。
Enoch Wu, a former Special Forces officer, has been leading these classes for the past year. In the wake of the Ukraine crisis, he's observed a renewed interest in these courses.
Gotten a very strong demand signal from the public that they wanted to be better trained, to be better prepared, and to know how to help each other in events of emergencies. And so we moved up our class schedule by a couple months. And as soon as we opened up our April classes, they were filled within an hour or two. We're all heartened and touched and moved by average Ukrainians' will to protect their country and their homes. And so what transpired over the past couple months, and as a Taiwanese, it's that much clear that we need to be better prepared against any crises during peacetime so that we can prevent war from happening in the first place, so we can maintain our peace.
那个乌克兰的总统泽伦斯基他就讲说，如果当有战争来的时候，乌克兰人民他不会向后靠，他会正面的面对俄罗斯。那时候我就会觉得说，对呀，台湾人也不可能向后靠，台湾人也一定要正面的面对这件事情的时候，那才会开始想说，那我们到底要怎么正面面对这件事情？每个人应该要做好自己的工作。那我作为一个普通人，我觉得我也应该要做好自己的准备。
Some people in Taiwan, or actually a lot of people around the world, are talking about Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow. I don't agree on that, but still, that has caused some mental threat, psychological threat to the people in Taiwan. Because quite of our people are afraid that what if there would be an invasion from the Chinese mainland on Taiwan? So we would not like to see any war happening on this piece of land.
In the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, observers around the world were quick to point out the similarities between Ukraine and Taiwan. But Beijing has sought to de-link the two conflicts.
台湾问题同乌克兰问题有着本质区别，两者没有任何可比性。最根本的不同在于，台湾是中国领土不可分割的一部分，台湾问题完全是中国的内政，而乌克兰问题呢，则是俄罗斯和乌克兰两个国家之间的争端。
Lately, both China and the United States have been trading blame for the heightened tensions in the Taiwan Strait. The U.S. is calling China out for this.
Taiwan's defense ministry says Chinese fighter jets have approached the island for a second day in a row.
在昨天一整天，总共有38架的攻击扰台。
And a record number of China aircraft enter Taiwan's air defense zone. The island is on high alert, raising concerns around the region.
光是昨天的39架次的扰台，已经创下今年单日最高纪录。
I hear you that China seeks peaceful reunification, but why then do we see so many frequent incidents of Chinese warplanes flying to Taiwan airspace?
Because someone is provoking the bottom line of China. For many years, the United States acknowledged and agreed that they will have no government-to-government relations with Taiwan. They will only have economic, trade, cultural exchanges with Taiwan. Now you see more and more U.S. civilian government officials, even military officials, delegations of all kinds visiting Taiwan. They are urging the Taiwanese independence movement to become bolder and bolder.
I think Washington finds this narrative frustrating, but somewhat laughable at this point. Everything is Washington's fault, right? If China engages in more bomber patrols around Taipei, that's somehow Washington's fault.
If we talk about the military tensions, the military tension in the Taiwan Straits generally is caused by the People's Liberation Army, who has had the mission to take Taiwan back if necessary. So we have seen the recent the PLA's presence around Taiwan. So that's a very important sign for Taiwan society to know that the goal of the PRC to reunite with Taiwan has never stopped.
Over the past 5 years, relations between Beijing and Taipei have broken down.
台湾的民主自由要赢台共心。
As Taiwan's ruling Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, hardened its stance against the mainland. Within the Taiwanese community, voices pushing for independence have also been getting louder. And Beijing's patience is wearing thin.
通过大搞两个中国和一中一台，歪曲台湾的历史，割裂台湾的根脉，到头来必将葬送台湾的未来。
The reality is, the majority of Taiwan's population are wary about rocking the boat with China. In fact, in 2019, voters were so dissatisfied with the DPP government's tough stance against Beijing and its cost on Taiwan's economy that they nearly voted President Tsai Ing-wen out of office. Events in neighboring Hong Kong helped turn the tide in Tsai's favor.
香港的抗争越来越激烈，未来中国给台湾的压力只会更多，不会更少。在这种局势之下，台湾需要的是一个稳健、理性的领导人。
And now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has created yet another opportunity for Tsai to maintain her political momentum. Her first move was to revise the territory's reservist laws and raise military spending, all in the name of defending Taiwan's democracy. And while the moves were expected, it was the fanfare and fashion of those announcements that raised eyebrows.
President Tsai appeared in a military uniform, announcing her plan, increasing military budget, and a possible change in the voluntary service regulations. But I think it's more a way for the public relations of the Tsai Ing-wen administration so that our people can feel more confident that this government is doing something beneficial and positive for Taiwan during the crisis between Ukraine and Russia. Another reason why President Tsai did that is that the U.S. has been asking Taiwan to increase Taiwan's national defense budget to a higher level so that Taiwan can show its true determination for self-defense.
As a vital hub for manufacturing semiconductors, Taiwan is far more important to the global economy than Ukraine is. And the U.S. is already taking action to protect these global interests, much to China's displeasure. Inside one of Taiwan's top institutions, preparations are being made for war with China. The 700,000 treasures here represent 8,000 years of Chinese history. Following reports that even museums were not spared during the bombardments in Ukraine, leading to the destruction of thousands of cultural artifacts, the museum established a special task force to devise plans to evacuate its treasures in the event of war. Xiao Qingwang is a leading archaeologist in Taiwan, so he's watching these plans closely.
我们拥有整个华人地区最重要的故宫博物院，它所典藏的这些传世品其实非常的珍贵，尤其是它很多的珍品，还有一些跟我们在整个华夏文化里面非常直接关系的这些古物。其实如果有这些的武装冲突的时候，那我们一定要先前的防范未然，然后能够居安思危去思考，可能有一天我们的一个文化也可能会受到摧毁。
The fact that collections belonging to generations of Chinese emperors now sit in a museum 2,000 kilometers away from the Forbidden City says a lot about Taiwan's complex history. Over the past 4 centuries, the island was governed by the Dutch, Spanish, China's Qing dynasty, and even the Japanese before returning to Chinese rule. Then in 1950, it became the seat of a government in exile after China's nationalist forces, led by Chiang Kai-shek, fled the mainland following a crushing defeat by the Chinese Communist Party. Today, Beijing continues to seek reunification. At the Chinese Communist Party's 100th anniversary celebrations in 2021, President Xi Jinping makes clear how he sees the Taiwan issue being resolved.
解决台湾问题，实现祖国完全统一，是中国共产党矢志不渝的历史任务，是全体中华儿女的共同愿望。坚决粉碎任何台独图谋，共创民族复兴美好未来。
The majority of the world, including the United States, recognized the One China policy. In fact, Taiwan figured prominently in 3 joint statements made by the U.S. and China between 1972 and 1982. Known as the 3 communiques, they enshrine a commitment to these key principles. There can only be one China. The People's Republic of China is the sole legal government of China. And the U.S. would continue selling arms to Taiwan at a level consistent with China's militarization of the Taiwan Strait. 40 years on, the United States still abides by the 3 communiques.
They have to decide. They, Taiwan, not us. And we are not encouraging independence. We're encouraging that they do exactly what the Taiwan Act requires. And that's what we're doing. Let them make up their mind, period.
The U.S. position on the One China policy is often misstated, I think intentionally so, in China. The U.S. One China policy does not say that Taiwan is part of China or that China is part of Taiwan. The U.S. One China policy says that the U.S. recognizes that Beijing and Taipei each believe that there is only one China, that the U.S. is neutral on the final settlement, but that the settlement must be peaceful, and that the U.S. will do things to help ensure that. And the U.S.-Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 made that very concrete. The U.S. will take steps to ensure that Taiwan can defend itself against invasion.
In recent months, the U.S. has upset Beijing by sending delegations of high-ranking U.S. officials to Taiwan. Speaker Nancy Pelosi is the latest on a guest list that has attracted the ire of China.
U.S. strategy is more and more clear. They seduce Russia to use of force in Ukraine. And then they want to seduce Taiwan independence. And then maybe actually let China to use of force to unify Taiwan. China is very cautious. China is very patient. Not let the U.S. strategy be succeeded.
Why does the U.S. keep sending senior officials to Taiwan?
There was an enormous amount of anxiety in Taipei and in other capitals throughout Asia that the Ukraine crisis would either be taken as an excuse by China for greater provocation toward Taiwan, or that it would raise questions about U.S. distraction. That if the U.S., in confronting this really generational upheaval in Europe, would take its eye off the ball yet again in Asia. The U.S. is committed to doing both. That China remains the top competitor, that Russia is a spoiler and has to be dealt with, but that the U.S. remains committed to the resiliency of Taiwan and helping Taiwan deter Chinese aggression.
I can assure you, no U.S. president will send any single American soldier to fight for the independence of Taiwan. Why? Because it will be completely against the fundamental interests of the American people. The American people do not want to see their sons and daughters die for the so-called independence of Taiwan.
U.S. arms sales to Taiwan also angers China.
Condemnation from China over the United States' latest planned arms sale to Taiwan. Beijing has told Washington to immediately revoke the sales plan for the island's missile upgrades. Now, the Chinese say that they will take robust measures to uphold their security interests.
Based on the Taiwan Relations Act, the U.S. is able to provide with Taiwan necessary defensive nature of weapons so that Taiwan can carry enough defense capability to deter aggression of mainland China. This is very important. With this U.S. defense assistance, can Taiwan be more confident in negotiating or interacting with the Beijing authorities? Without these weapons, Taiwan is just like a tiger without teeth. And the Beijing authorities will have so many different means to make Taiwan kowtow to Beijing authorities.
they want to send more weapons to Taiwan. Actually, the Americans will make a lot of money out of arms sale to Taiwan.
My advice to the U.S. on how to manage the Taiwan issue is to let sleeping dogs lie, to allow the status quo to continue as long as possible, because the status quo has kept peace. There are very few predictions I dare to make in geopolitics very confidently. One prediction I make very confidently is that if the government in Taiwan declares that Taiwan no longer represents the Republic of China, but instead is an independent sovereign state, China will declare war. And for all of us who want to prevent wars in this region, let's advise Taiwan to keep to the status quo.
Strategic ambiguity is the thing that allows the U.S. both to help dissuade China from using force, but also not back China into a corner so much that it feels it has no choice but to use force. And so the goal really has to be to continue to buy time indefinitely for facts on the ground to change such that a cross-strait peaceful resolution becomes possible. And it has to remain very clear that there will be terrible repercussions for Beijing should it resort to force. It's not going to spell out exactly what that playbook is.
I don't think the war will happen so long as the Beijing authorities sees some possibilities of peaceful unification with Taiwan. That is why we have seen some rounds of discussions on mainland China about one country, two system, Taiwan formula. At least the Beijing authorities is still trying to find a peaceful way to woo the support of some Taiwan people and trying to make sure that peaceful unification still works.
Both China and the U.S. hope for the Taiwan conflict to be resolved without the use of force. Developments would be closely monitored by the world, especially neighboring countries. Japan and South Korea are now increasing their military budgets as tensions in East Asia increase. As the horrors in Ukraine unfolded, a long taboo topic came up for debate. The issue is whether to allow Japan to introduce a nuclear sharing arrangement to deploy U.S. nuclear weapons on its soil and jointly operate them. Nuclear sharing was established within NATO in the late 1950s. Under the arrangement, Germany and some other non-nuclear NATO states store U.S. nuclear weapons in their territories and maintain their own means of weapons delivery.
I think Japanese politicians watching what's happened with Ukraine has brought home the take-home lesson to some Japanese politicians that nuclear deterrent may be an important way to push back against not only North Korea, which is developing weapons of mass destruction, but also pushing back against what the Japanese understand as assertive Chinese behavior in the East China Sea, South China Sea, and across the Taiwan Straits.
The government of Prime Minister Kishida has taken a stand against the idea, and it's because of this. The horrors of Hiroshima, an atomic bomb city, are still remembered. Though 77 years have passed since the day, the memory has not faded. Yasuhiro Asieda, who's 76, comes early in the morning every year on the date of the anniversary. He was only 11 months old when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on 6 August 1945, flattening the city and killing 140,000 people.
私らもそれ相応の年になりましたんでね。だからあと先は短いし、いうようなことで、平和な世界であれば一番。
Prime Minister Kishida comes from Hiroshima, and the issue of nuclear weapons is a red line he cannot cross. After World War II, peace was prized here. Japan adopted 3 nuclear principles of not possessing, not producing, and not permitting the introduction of nuclear weapons into its territory. But developments in Taiwan are troubling the Japanese. Polls found that 9 in 10 Japanese fear China will invade Taiwan.
Japan's relations with China have been very, very sour for the past more than past 2 decades. And Japan has been facing a serious challenge coming from China in terms of Senkaku Island related issue and also other security related issues. In Japan, there are less than 10% of the people feel affinity toward China, and distrust against China is very deep. On the contrary, Japanese affinity toward Taiwan is really high, more than 80%. And the people-to-people relations are really good. So I think that it is quite natural for the Japanese people to worry about Taiwan contingency.
There's strong security concerns about China in Japan, but in the same polls, Japanese recognize China as the most important economic partner within the region. And $210 billion of Japanese exports went to China last year. And this is despite the COVID-19 pandemic and despite these unfavorable ratings. This economic relationship is something that's very, very difficult to detangle. And I just don't think the Japanese are interested in detangling. Rather, they want to make sure that they can have the benefits, but also be in a position of caution vis-a-vis China on critical issues to Japan's interests, like Taiwan.
Over in China, Japan's actions during World War II continue to color opinions. After a statement by former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe that a crisis in Taiwan would be an emergency for Japan and for the U.S.-Japan alliance, the Chinese government responded by criticizing various Japanese misdeeds, from its wartime aggression to the decision to release contaminated water from Fukushima into the Pacific Ocean.
近期，日本个别政客接二连三在台湾问题上大放厥词，妄议中国内政，中方对此表示坚决反对。日本历史上发动侵华战争，对台湾进行长达半个世纪的殖民统治，犯下罄竹难书的罪行，对中国人民负有严重历史罪责。日本政客近期频频发表涉台谬论，甚至公然发表违背本国无核三原则，充分暴露出日本国内军国主义势力阴魂不散的危险动向。台湾是中国的事，不关日本的事。
Japan's participation in the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad, has also drawn anger from China.
美日印澳拼凑的所谓四边机制，实质上是遏制、围堵中国、维护美国霸权的工具。这是在人为的挑动对立，破坏国际团结与合作。
Then there's the Senkaku, or Jiao Yui Dao, island disputes. They are currently controlled by Japan, but China also claims sovereignty over the islands.
China's pressure towards Senkaku Islands is still very strong. They send their vessels into the contiguous zones in the Senkaku Islands, and they're staying there all the time. There used to be non-equipped weapons, but now they equip weapons. And Japanese government sent a démarche, diplomatic démarche, to Beijing every day. Every day.
What we generally see, if Japan does, for example, has a joint exercise within the Quad, we will see those merchant vessels in increased numbers go in and out of the waters surrounding the Senkaku Islands. And when there's relative less tension in the relationship, the numbers go down. So it's a gauge to see how much displeasure there is in Beijing about Japan's cooperation within the Quad or statements on Taiwan. So I think the leaders are very reticent to criticize each country because they want to maintain those strong economic relations. So we see very little criticism about President Xi by Japanese politicians, and very little criticism about Japanese politicians by Chinese counterparts. But they send their displeasure through an increased number of vessels in and around Japanese waters, or in the case of Taiwan, of course, circumnavigating Taiwan with fighter planes.
China and Japan mark the 50th anniversary of normalization of diplomatic ties this year. But the mood is not celebratory. In 2021, some 71% of Japanese said China posed a threat, up from 63% in 2020. Likewise, 66% of Chinese had negative views of Japan, up from 53%. Perhaps economic ties might soothe relations. China hopes to further strengthen economic ties through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. China and Japan are among its 15 member nations.
I do think that there is bright spots in terms of thinking about Sino-Japanese relations. First, at the trade level, they continue to cooperate in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This will spearhead further integration within the region. There is some talk about a trilateral free trade agreement between South Korea, China, and Japan. So in that sense, there's still a commitment to engaging with China at the trade level. Japan remains committed to the Chinese economy. And the Chinese government, especially at the local level, is very committed to a strong economic relations between China and Japan. It's Japanese businesses that have hired millions of Chinese in China. They provide technological infusion, human capacity building, and local governments in China welcome that investment. So those ties remain strong, but of course the direction of China today is moving towards a more inward-looking, I think, nationalist view, and this will impact, I think, those strong ties that have maintained a relative balance between the two states up to now.
In March 2022, South Korea elected a new president. Yoon Suk-yeol promised to be tougher on China during his campaign.
지금 현 정부가 굉장히 중국 편향적인 이런 정책을 써왔습니다마는 한국 국민들, 특히 청년들의 대부분은 중국을 싫어합니다. 그리고 중국 사람들, 중국의 청년들의 대부분이 또 한국을 싫어합니다. 근데 과거에는 그렇지 않았습니다. 이렇게 중국 편향적인 정책을 쓰고.
In his first press conference after his victory, Yoon said that he wants to bolster South Korea's defense capabilities and strengthen cooperation with the United States and Japan.
국민의 안전과 재산, 영토와 주권을 지키기 위해 어떠한 도발도 확실하게 억제할 수 있는 강력한 국방력을 구축하겠습니다.
After years of careful and strategic political maneuvering, tending to relations with China, the U.S., and North Korea, President Yoon was redrawing lines. This realignment comes on the back of a string of cultural clashes.
Recently, I would say more from the South Korean public side, there have been a series of these incidents that have really upset people. You know, claims about kimchi being Chinese. During the Winter Olympics, this flared up over the presentation of hanbok, of Korean traditional dress, being presented as one of the ethnic minority costumes in the opening ceremony.
Remarks and representations which might have assaulted cultural nerves of South Koreans.
Some of these cultural storms, I think, would just be that. They'd be a storm in a teacup, and everyone would just move on. But each one of these incidents just slowly, it keeps tipping the lever, and we've seen this in polling to indicate the general view of China among the South Korean public is increasingly negative.
Incidents on the high seas contribute to that negativity. As Chinese demand for seafood increases, its fishing fleet finds itself pushing the limits of its territorial boundaries.
This is another one of these chronic irritants that goes back for decades in the relationship, and we've seen that actually become quite violent, and you've seen loss of life at sea on both sides, but in particular, you've seen South Korean Coast Guards die in these clashes. So it's a real problem. It's a chronic problem.
The China's fishing vessels' illegal encroachment caused the economic loss to the South Korean fishermen. So it caused a kind of anti-China sentiment at the civilian level. South Korea and China started to proceed the maritime boundary negotiations, and they made efforts to root out those Chinese fishing vessels' illegal invasion.
But it is defense issues that create complex diplomatic scuffles between South Korea and China. In 2016, South Korea deployed THAAD, an anti-missile system designed to shoot down incoming missiles. It was a system that was supposed to shield them from North Korean missiles.
South Korea deployed a THAAD system for its national security, but China approached it through the prism of U.S.-China relations. They perceived that the THAAD system was to spy on its territory.
The Chinese authorities retaliated by closing nearly half of Lotte's 112 stores across China. South Korean firms suffered losses of an estimated $7.5 billion.
Lotte was probably the poster child of here's what we'll do to you, South Korea, if you make a national security decision that we don't approve of. You know, we will take it out on you economically. That was the message that South Korea received over THAAD, and it's certainly not been forgotten. It left a very bad long-term impression and negativity toward China that they'd be willing to do that they would be willing to create that kind of economic pain on South Korea for a national security decision.
After the THAAD incident, I think South Korea learned the risk of economic dependence on China. With the intensifying U.S.-China relations, it turns out South Korea should make more careful approach to South Korea-China relations within the structure of U.S.-China confrontation.
While former President Moon Jae-in has tried to pacify the Chinese, much of that diplomacy might come to naught because of incoming President Yoon Suk-yeol. The new president was voted in on rising anti-Chinese sentiment.
서로의 그 안보를 피로써 지키기로 약속한 그런 국가이기 때문에 거기에 걸맞는 그런 관계가 다시 자리를 잡아야 할 것으로 저는 생각합니다.
In the lead up to the elections, President Yoon had pledged to deploy additional units of the THAAD anti-missile system.
I think it is a kind of rhetoric to secure the conservative vote by emphasizing the difference from the Moon Jae-in government. The priority of his foreign policy is to abandon the strategic ambiguity and reinforce the South Korea-US alliance.
If the new administration makes the decision, yeah, we want as many THAAD batteries as we can take, the Chinese are almost certainly going to return to the kind of economic punishment that they did before. That's going to cost South Koreans on the economic ledger, and is that a cost that they really want to absorb right now? What's the cost-benefit analysis?
Will it be a risk South Korea is willing to take? South Korea abandoned its nuclear weapons development in the 1970s. But a survey conducted in December 2021 showed 71% of South Koreans were in favor of the country developing its own nuclear weapons.
The perception shift in South Korea, I think, was caused by the fact that there is no sign of improvement in denuclearizing North Korea. South Korea's nuclear armament can be a great military pressures on South Korea and China, but at the same time, it is highly likely to intensify military tensions and arms race in the region instead.
But for now, I don't see that as, again, something that the new administration right out of the gates is going to say, okay, great, we're here, and South Korea wants its own nuclear weapons. That would be a highly destabilizing geopolitical move for the region, and I'm not sure that that really serves South Korea's interests.
Whether or not South Korea participates in the Quad, or Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, is also a subject of debate. The Quad has Australia, Japan, India, and the U.S. as member countries.
There's also questions of whether the Quad actually wants South Korea as a member. I would not say that Japan-South Korea relations are particularly good, and Japan is obviously a core member of the Quad. So does Tokyo really want South Korea diluting the Quad brand with its presence? I think that's actually an open question.
Chinese state media warn South Korea that joining the Quad will damage relations.
Well, I think we've definitely shifted towards what we call a bipolar system. The two big poles, of course, of the United States and China. So what does this mean? If we moved into a bipolar world, it suggests that the United States and like-minded countries are going to build deterrence capabilities, build engagement capabilities, and of course, when there's disagreements with China, push back against China's actions. And China as well is going to start to build its own network of countries, I think mostly emerging countries, through the BRI, as well as insulate its economy from future fiscal sanctions that they've watched be very effective against the Russian economy, to create a Chinese sphere of influence through the BRI. And this is how I understand global order moving forward.
Whether there will be a new international order, I do not know. I love the current international order. China has benefited a great deal by fully becoming integrated with the international order. We understand it, and China will be a champion of defending the current international order. What China does not like is for any country in the world try to dictate its will onto any other country in the world. Now, that may apply to the United States. We do not want to see a unilateral world involving any single power holding itself as a hegemon, dictating its terms to all the other countries. We actually do not like to see any country holding itself out as possessing the total truth, the complete truth, nothing but the truth. Why? Because we simply do not believe it.
a new world order can be very confusing because our world order is actually very dynamic and changing. Believe me, when China becomes the #1 economy in the world, that will be another significant shift in the world. So we are clearly experiencing major changes, but at the same time, we can try to make these changes all peaceful. We need to step up the level of diplomatic engagement and have far more dialogues, more face-to-face diplomacy in East Asia.